Is it right to judge others? It used to be that John 3:16 was the most often quoted verse in the Bible. Today it seems the most often quoted verse is Matthew 17. Judge not that you be not judged. Some use it without realizing its true meaning, and others, Christians, non-Christians, use it to avoid accountability. Hypocrites, for example, would use it to avoid being challenged in their wrongdoing. It seems to be used as the gospel by pro-gay groups, liberal politicians, and others. When they take the verse out of context, they can change the meaning of it, and they have done this with Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. What does this verse really mean? Does this verse teach that we cannot judge others? No, it doesn't. Let's look. The next verse down, Matthew 7:2, tells us that we will be judged by the same standard we judge others. So it isn't prohibiting judgment. In Matthew 7:16, we're told how to recognize the false prophets. It says, you will recognize them by their fruits. Jesus would not be telling us how to recognize false prophets if he did not expect us to judge them and as being true prophets or false prophets. Our world is characterized by deceit and falsehood, making it absolutely necessary that we judge. We have a command in Matthew chapter 24, verse 4, to not be deceived. We can only fulfill that command if we judge. However, we are commanded to not judge by appearance, but to judge righteous judgment. And that's in John chapter 7, verse 24. It says, judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And by the way, you can only judge righteous judgment if you're saved. A lost person is not righteous and cannot understand the spiritual things of God. Therefore, the answer to our question is that Christians are to judge others. If judging others is unchristian as some charge, we would be unable to have the various levels of government. We would be unable to be a good parent. We would certainly make a poor employer. None of us would be able to sit on the jury, and the list goes on. Jesus does not condemn, or does condemn rather, a critical and a judgmental spirit, one with a sense of moral superiority. He commanded us to examine ourselves first for the problems that we so easily see in others. Excuse me. It is when we examine ourselves that we can better see the problem and get help for our own problem first. Christians are not only commanded to judge, but to judge righteously and not just by appearance in John 7:24. Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Christians must use spiritual discernment in coming to conclusions on matters of right or wrong or good and evil. Judgment that judges right from wrong, good from evil, is always a legitimate judgment for Christians. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 14 states, but strong meat belongs to them that are of full age, even those who, by reason of use, have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. So Christians can discern both good and evil, which according to the Bible is legitimate judgment. If a person is wrong, and I tell them they're doing wrong, I am not judging that person, but I am judging that person's behavior. God will judge the intent or motivation of man, according to Romans chapter 2, verse 16. It says, in that day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. The Greek word for judge is krino, which means, according to Vine's expository dictionary of the New Testament word, to separate and choose, hence to determine, and so to judge, pronounce judgment. And this is spiritual discernment, and we shall see the following. It is required by God. Judgment for punishment or sentencing belongs to God, not to mankind. That's in Romans 12:19 explains, dearly beloved, avenge not yourself, but give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, it says, And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. So Paul, writing to the Christians, or the Corinthians, stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, the saints, the believers, shall judge the world. So judging is not only permitted, but required. If a Christian has a matter against another Christian, he or she is to take it before the saints or the believers. This can only be done if Christians can judge the right or wrong of the matter. Therefore, it is not unchristian to judge others when done in a righteous manner. Now look at the next two verses, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 3 through 4. Not only is mankind held to a standard, this verse implies that the angels also have a standard. The saints or believers are to judge angels, so there must be a standard for them as well as for mankind. Obviously, Christians are to judge the things that pertain to this life. There is a proper way to judge. Matthew 7:1 states, Judge not, that ye be not judged. This means that we can judge, but we must first judge ourselves, confessing our sins, and then judge righteously, not condemning. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 31 through 32, if we as Christians would judge ourselves first and judge others in the same manner, we would certainly be more charitable in judging others. Some would say, hey, I've seen you do the same thing. You cannot judge me for doing it. And this is covered in the verse following the judge not verse in Matthew. Matthew chapter 7, verse 4 through 5. Says, before I can judge another, I must not have any unconfessed sin in my life. If I have unconfessed sin in my life, then I cannot judge. When I come before God in prayer and confess those sins, I can then judge properly. Therefore, having done the same thing, I can still judge if my sins have been dealt with. If I confess my sins, I can then biblically judge others. There are many biblical examples that show Christians are required to judge. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, and the verses following, Paul writes of a church member living in open immorality. This church member's sin was being ignored. And when Paul heard of it, he judged the immorality of the sin and demanded the member be turned over to Satan for destruction of the flesh. In other words, he was put outside the spiritual protection of the local church. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 3. Therefore, the church, which is an assembly of believers, is to judge members of the assembly. Further on in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 to 16, we're told to beware of false prophets. If we are to beware of false prophets, we must be able to know them, and we can only do that by judging. Verse 16 goes on to tell us we shall know them by their fruit. So we are to judge them by their fruit. Verse 17 explains further about the fruit. Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. So the letter to Ephesians gives us more information about fruit. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11 says, Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. To have no fellowship with unfruitful works of darkness, we must be able to judge. And not only that, we are to reprove them. Many Christians are wrongly judged for judging right or wrong, never mind reproving anyone. When you reprove anyone, anger is stirred up. But the Bible tells us to reprove them. So right after the judge not passage, we have a few verses later a command in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again to rend you. It is obvious that one must exercise spiritual discernment by judging to fulfill that command. What standard are we to use for spiritual discernment? The original question of judgment was the use of the Bible verse of Matthew 7:1 to judge not. Since the Bible verse was first used, it is the Bible that is to be used as a standard of right and wrong in spiritual discernment. The Bible has the only absolute moral standards, but the relativists would respond that there are no absolute standards, and those who use them are being arrogant and judgmental. These accusations are unwarranted. But the absolutist could respond that the relativist has just made a judgment and is also being arrogant and judgmental. If a Christian makes a judgment from the sense of moral superiority, he or she would be wrong. The proper sense of morality would be that except for the grace of God, there go I, rather than a false sense of moral superiority. The Bible requires a Christian to use spiritual discernment to come to the truth of a matter. But nowhere does the Bible address this matter for an unbeliever, possibly because the unbeliever is unable to use spiritual discernment, since he or she is spiritually dead. Thank you for listening.